Hi everyone, my name's Hannah. I'm the co-founder of Shado, which is a multimedia platform using lived experience to drive social change at the intersection of art, activism and academia. Thanks to GoClimate, tonight we've got a really special event. It's an introduction to holding the fashion industry to account, why climate justice needs fair fashion. And I'm joined by an incredible panel of experts who I will let introduce themselves and in no particular order, but I guess in a particular order, because I'll start with Zainab, if we could just kick off the introductions.
Hi, I'm Zainab. I do climate justice and slow fashion content mainly on Instagram, but I also do freelance writing. So I've written for Shado, collaborated with Fashion Revolution, but I do that on the side of a full-time job. It's nice to be called an expert because I wouldn't call myself that. And I've learned from people who are on this panel as well. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks so much and welcome. Next we have Flora.
Hi, I'm Flora. I'm a food, fitness and sustainability blogger. If you look at my page, it will primarily be a lot of fitness content, but I also write for other publications about sustainability. And I come from a background in biology, so I kind of come from the science angle of things.
And at Shado, we were introduced to Flora by Sienna at Fashion Revolution, who we've also worked with before. So it's amazing. It's amazing to finally meet you, Flora. And next for introductions, can I go to Aditi?
Hi everyone, my name's Aditi Meyer. I'm based out of Los Angeles. Excuse me. I am a photojournalist, sustainable fashion blogger, and labor rights activist. And my work looks at the fashion industry through a lens of decolonization and intersectionality. So I draw a lot from my work grassroots organizing here in my locality in LA to the historical context of colonial models in fashion from my motherland and South Asia as a whole. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. And last but not least, can we go to Maya? And could you also join into your introduction what role you see yourself playing in the move towards a more equitable fashion industry? And we'll go back round with the same question.
So my name is Maya Penn. I'm a 21-year-old environmental justice and climate justice activist. I'm also a sustainable fashion designer. I have been in this space for 13 years now. I actually became both a sustainable fashion designer and an activist in 2008 when I was just 8 years old. So, this is something that I come by very honestly. I really grew up, it really being conscious about the impact that we have as individuals on both people and the planet. I have, written a book published through Simon & Schuster around this journey. I've given 3 TED Talks on sustainability and fashion, climate change, using art to drive change. And I've also received a commendation from US President Barack Obama for outstanding achievement in environmental stewardship. And I really, personally, as somebody who has been in this space for 13 years, I think that, what's been really important to me is to speak, to speak to individuals about the impact they have, but also to empower them to hold industry and local, state, and government leaders accountable at the same time. And so I've really been focused in on being really solutions based and really showing people kind of creating a transparency around the fashion industry, how everything works the way it does, and why there's such a negative impact on the environment and on people. And for people to continue to stay optimistic, because that is an important for change. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And Flora, I wonder if I could go to you, because you were saying kind of that you come at climate justice from a very scientific background. What do you see as your role in kind of a drive towards more equitable fashion industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically science has lacked the individual viewpoint of the real people who are actually impacted by these sorts of topics. So I'm still very much learning, I learned from everyone else on this panel as well, kind of day to day. But in terms of the role that I think my page plays, for example, is in drawing people into sustainability and ethical fashion who may not have ever even thought about it or been introduced to the topic before. A lot of people who are coming to my page might be coming for fitness information or health information or mental health topics. They might not be coming to me to learn about sustainability. And while I'm still very much learning so much on the topic myself, I like to introduce people to the topic because it isn't just a topic in its own right. It really affects every different part of our life, and that includes things like health, fitness, the clothes that we wear when we run, spending time in the outdoors. And if there's something that I know about runners and people who are interested in spending time outside, is that they care about nature and they're kind of predisposed to really want to make that a nicer space to be.
Thank you. And Aditi, could I go to you next? See you nodding on that.
Yeah, so for me, I guess the way I always approach this work is, one, we obviously have to, advance the agenda of sustainable fashion, but it's really important for me to also think about the ways that we can dismantle the fast fashion model, because although sustainable fashion is great, we need to question why we have an alternative industry, which means that we have normalized violence as part of the business model in the traditional fashion industry. So for me, that looks a lot like building workers' power at the bottom through grassroots organizing and policy work, and making sure that my narrative when it comes to being someone in the sustainable fashion space is going beyond the narrative of buying our way into a new reality. I think we need to be conscious about the historical underpinnings that created the systems and the fact that we can't buy our way out of that. The fact that there is a huge class and racial dynamic to these industries. So we always have to be interrogating power from a very intersectional lens. And sustainability requires context. So not having, widespread, like one size fits all approaches to sustainability. So that's a little bit about my vantage point.
Thanks so much. And then last but not least, could I go for Zainab?
I would say, put simply, my work is there to just spread the word. So I can't control what other people take from that or what actions they take, even if I suggest actions, because the power that you have to make change is really dependent on your specific life and lifestyle. So my Instagram page in particular is very information based, and then occasionally I will share my thoughts and ideas about a certain topic. But I always loved styling myself, and I loved shopping as a child and as a teenager. And I had a lot of different ideas as a teenager and a young adult for different blogs and Instagram pages and YouTube channels to do with fashion. But it was only when I started thinking about ethical fashion and then also intersectional environmentalism that I finally thought I really have a place and a voice that isn't as loud as other people's. So I should really be putting that out there. So I did start off doing outfit pictures, but the captions were always about the environment, the environmental or human impact of the fashion industry. And then now I've kind of phased out the outfits, even though I really still do love styling myself, and I do share that sometimes, but I dressed up for this, but otherwise I'm wearing leggings and tracksuit bottoms all the time and have been since March last year. I'm not really fussed about getting dressed every day. So yeah.
Thanks. And Aditi, I wondered if I could go back to you, kind of the point that you were making. I wondered whether you could just unpack, like, what do we mean by fast fashion?
Yeah, totally. So by definition, the term fast fashion was born when it was coined by the New York Times in the 1980s. And they were referring to Zara's 15-day turnaround when it came to producing products. But I think beyond just like where the word came from, it's really important to know that the fast fashion model is predicated on speed at all costs, speed at the cost of the environment, quality, and garment worker rights. And so my relationship with really seeing, the dangers of a system predicated on speed at all costs was what catalyzed my work in this space, which was in 2013, the Rana Plaza factory collapse. And so for those that are not familiar, Rana Plaza was an 8-story garment factory in Bangladesh, creating for some of the world's, most well-known fast fashion names. And what really struck me about Rana Plaza was that it was an avoidable disaster. So, structural cracks were found in the building the day before it fell. But there was so much pressure from upper management to have workers come back to work and complete orders that they were called back to work. And so, Rana Plaza is the biggest industrial disaster of our time. It killed over 1,100 people. And so, that the knee-jerk reaction to Rana Plaza was sustainable fashion and ethical fashion, which was great. But Rana Plaza spoke to a deeper, disturbing reality that's replicating itself throughout the world. And so I think it's really important to keep that framing in mind when we're talking about fast fashion.
Thanks so much. And Maya, I wondered if you wanted to come in on that. I know you're nodding quite a lot throughout.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm glad that Aditi brought up Rana Plaza, because I know that that's something that kickstarted a lot of people's, step into really fighting for ethical and sustainable fashion. But just kind of to that question of summarizing fast fashion, the fashion industry, this idea of ready to wear fashion was, something that was completely, obsolete until really kind of the industrial era. And, from there, companies wanted to put more dollars into advertising. They didn't want to put as many dollars into the quality of their clothing. And so, it's kind of is a slow, but, steady kind of downhill journey that the fashion industry took beyond just, really something that is more focused on, the individual consumer, and it was more of a customized experience. It was more of just a genuine like art form first, before it was completely about making as much money as possible. And then it evolved into that trajectory just to be about making as much money as possible. And I think that, I've seen a lot of people get really frustrated because, especially a lot of just general consumers, because they feel like they can't win no matter what they do. And the reason why I say that is because, a lot of people, for example, like we talk a lot about, needing to have some sort of a proximity to affluence in order to support sustainable fashion brands. So then people take this alternative shopping at, secondhand and thrift stores, which is great. But, there's also this other side to, secondhand and thrift stores. A lot of, those clothes are going to predominantly Black, Brown, and, Indigenous communities. I'm actually on the board of a nonprofit called The Revival that's based out of Accra, Ghana. And they basically tackle this exact issue, but within that local community, of how a lot of secondhand clothing is ending up like on their beaches. It's also drowning out the Ghanaian textile industry, Ghanaian culture, because there's culture and meaning behind clothing for many people. And a lot of that has been kind of phased out because, we've made clothing just about aesthetic. And so, all of that being said, I think that what's really important is to remember that fast fashion is this is something that the consumer did not create. This was created by the fashion industry, and the fashion industry always needs to be held to account. And so, I completely agree with supporting sustainable fashion brands from a consumer standpoint, but also those sustainable fashion brands need to be getting more support, and more, even from VCs, in order to be able to, work with more artisans and provide more, ethical and, well-paying jobs through their own companies. Like, if we want to create an ecosystem where we want to support the brands and the seamstresses and garment workers as well, in a way that's really substantial, we're going to really have to start redirecting where we're putting our energy, our time, attention, and money, not just as consumers, but also these people that are behind funding some of these larger fast fashion companies as well. So that didn't really answer the question of what fast fashion is, but it kind of just does cover a few layers on what people kind of struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fast fashion kind of it was born out of a context rather than just kind of appearing. And we've sort of touched on a couple of the themes that I know will come up in this question, but I wanted to sort of shift the conversation a bit more to like the colonial origins of forced labour and the exploitative fashion industry more specifically. I don't know if anyone wants to particularly come on first on that. Oh yeah, Aditi.
Yeah, so I talk a lot about the idea of decolonizing fashion. It's kind of become like the center point of my work. And I often get the question, well, what does that mean to decolonize fashion? And I always say it's really important to first establish what I mean by colonial practice. And colonial practice is the idea of the extraction and exploitation of resources, whether that's raw material or human labor, as a means for infinite growth and success. And I have that in air quotes. So like so many, global industries, the fashion industry is predicated on an unequal exchange. So we have the idea of the global South and the global North. And so the exchanges of manufactured products that are produced at shockingly low prices due to labor that costs near nothing to be sold at higher margins in the global North. And we know this to be true in the fashion industry because it's predicated on the global race to the bottom, which is the idea that brands are looking to produce as fast as they can, as much as they can, as cheap as they can, which means going to the countries that are still reeling from the impacts of colonialism and colonial violence, making them an especially vulnerable workforce, which is often the propelling tool of exploitation. And so, the business model in fashion has always kind of headed to the cheapest and parts of the world. And I say cheapest, I mean like cheap labor. And it's not because of better infrastructure or factories, it's because they can extract from that. And so we know this through the idea of sacrifice zones, which basically means that parts of the world whose vulnerable, populations undergo resource extraction and exploitation for this growth. And that is the racism that's built into the system, from the production level to what Maya was talking about of where our, disposed of goods end up going and end up, polluting those places of the world. But I guess I could, backtrack a bit and talk about the history behind that. I look a lot at the history of India because prior to colonization, India was 25% of the world's economy, predominantly through textiles and spices. And so when the British Empire came in the 16th century, they wanted in on that. And the empire that was created was an empire of cotton. So prior to colonization, we had very much like localized economies, especially localized textile economies that were rooted in artisan practices. And the larger domain of farming was sustenance farming. People farmed for their own communities with indigenous varieties. It wasn't, for global trade or anything. But there was a systemic plan put in place to convert sustenance farming into cotton farming. And India had to sell cotton as just the raw material to Britain, who would sell it back to India at a premium, which left our own spinners and weavers unable to afford this cotton. And there was this whole narrative created of the mills of Lancashire and Westminster in Britain that was, this new center of cotton in the world, but it was being extracted from India. But I think it's really important to note that the impacts of that, not only did it devastate our own artisan communities in India, it also completely degraded the food system because we switched from sustenance farming. But if you fast forward a bit more, around the 18th and 19th centuries, in the Americas, this was the time when indigenous folks were forcibly removed from their land. And suddenly they were creating space for plantations. But now there was so much land that they had to subjugate a whole nother population as slaves to, maintain cotton plantations. And so that was also positioning Britain as the cotton workshop of the world. So whether it's from the forced removal of indigenous communities in the Americas, the forced subjugation of a community into slavery, to India, we need to understand how the fashion system has been predicated on all of this exploitation. And the first big business boom that happened in America during Industrial Revolution was because of cotton. And it's really important to note that, the forced slavery of African peoples was a big part of that, but that history is very often ignored. So this is the exploitation and colonial models that have been rooted in fashion and continue to recreate themselves today. But I'll stop there because I'd love to hear from the other panelists as well.
On that note, I think certainly coming from a sustainable fashion, the science side of things, you sometimes forget that although that's obviously the history of the fashion industry now funnels more money into modern day slavery, like child labor and bonded labor, than any other industry other than tech. And 71% of the people in bonded labor and forced labor are women. And that's just another example of the kind of exploitation. I mean, for example, looking at what we see as sustainable fashion, cotton, for example, is quite often viewed as a sustainable choice, but if you ignore the ethics of it, then you might be ignoring the fact that Uyghur Muslims are working on cotton plantations for as kind of a slave labor. And we see this as a sustainable fabric and something that is natural and biodegradable, but it kind of conveniently forgets the fact that you can't separate out the sustainability of something and its ethics as well. And I think also, we think about the history of fashion as being in slavery, but I think the modern day of fashion, the way that it works at the moment, is also another form of slavery, whether that's through kind of holding back people's wages or fear of retribution if they quit. It's all forms of slavery, even if it's not called as such.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Flora. And I think now is almost an appropriate time to talk about what happened in Myanmar, or what has in February, but has only recently come out. Garment workers employed by Primark supplier GY Sen were locked inside the factory on February the 18th to prevent them from taking part in protests. And this is less a question and more of kind of like a discussion point that I wondered if anyone wanted to pick up on. Yeah, Maya?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to quickly say that, something to think about is these, the garment workers were among the first, to join these protests. And, I think that too, also people forget that a lot of these, you look at the young activists of the world, and, you don't always, I think a lot of people tend to overlook a lot of Black, brown, and Indigenous voices. A lot of these garment workers are also young and are also activists. And I think that this is a really good touch point for people to understand just how far the oppressive system within the fast fashion industry impacts all areas of life for these garment workers. When people think of, the average person might think of child labor, they might not realize that a lot of child laborers just cannot get an education because they are in that position, or that these garment workers, they're not able to exercise, their freedom of speech. And then also on top of that, they were being threatened prior to this military coup, because they were having like excessive workloads, and they were being threatened with dismissal if they didn't take on those extra shifts. So this is something that they've been dealing with even prior to wanting to join the protests. And I mean, this is more common than people think. People feel like this is a once in a while, situation. Like you have this, this one factory over here that makes this, more inhumane or cruel decision. But this is something that's very common, and a lot of large companies are, first of all, they are really good at keeping this under wraps. And, I think that ethical practices aren't really, brought up as much in conjunction with sustainable practices, because there is, we need a word for whatever, like the greenwashing equivalent would be for ethical practices as well. Because of course there's obviously greenwashing, but there is, also this cloak of, not wanting to talk about the ethical practices and the supply chains and how they're treating their workers and laborers, because by default, if we're working on sustainable clothing, then everything is fine. And that's not true. I think that people really do need to see that all of it is interconnected, which we are seeing. More people are are really learning that. And, you know, I'm someone who's been speaking about, you know, environmental justice and climate justice for a long time. I think there need to be climate reparations, you know, and that the global north needs to pay both financially and through resources for the impact they've had on the global south, and for Black, brown, indigenous communities in the global north as well. But I mean, these are conversations that need to be brought to the forefront. Hopefully, you know, what just happened will make some sort of an impact. And that kind of went on a bit of a tangent, but I really feel like, you know, this, hopefully, if we can just continue to, you know, push this story and push, you know, the really, you know, humanizing, you know, hey, the same way a lot of people were, you know, being basically fired from their jobs or not able to speak out about Black Lives Matter, you know, for example, this is what's happening right now as well in Myanmar. So just kind of making those different connections for people who want to learn more about ethical and unethical practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And Maya, I think it's interesting kind of what you said about we shouldn't just look at what happens as like isolated events, because it's happening everywhere. I mean, I know from a standpoint of like coming from the UK, maybe or the US, like the so-called like global north, but we had these exact like atrocities happening in Leicester during COVID-19. So yeah, I think it's really important not to think of things as just a one-off. Zainab, could I ask you?
Yeah, I was going to say that some consumers who don't want to face up to the atrocities in fashion supply chains like to perpetuate the narrative that it's the supplier's fault when these things happen. And I think that kind of narrative is very uninformed and turns a blind eye to the fact that this is an age-old system. Like Aditi has spoken, it's built on colonial practices that are hundreds of years old. And maybe you could argue there's an element of choice from the supplier's point of view, but there are so many layers of pressure, and garment workers are at the mercy of their managers in the factories, but they are also at the mercy of the brands. The power always lies where the money is, and the brands have the money. And that's it, I think.
On that note, on that exact note, I feel one thing I noticed was how keen Primark was to say, you know, we've paused all orders with the factory, we're not going to order from them, all of this kind of stuff. Protecting reputation, of course. But what I worry is that they haven't actually spoken to the actual garment workers who are going to be affected by cancelling the orders or pausing the orders. It's the same problem again and again. And people don't seem to be taking into account the fact that the garment workers know what they need from these brands. And if people actually stop to kind of think about that and talk to them and say, look, what do you need from us? They're the ones, the brands are the ones with the power, they're the ones with the money. They could affect the change if they wanted to affect the change. Holding their hands up and saying, oh yeah, well, we've stopped ordering from them, so it's not our problem anymore, is not going to help the situation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, well, as we've been talking a lot about garment workers, I think now's a good time to sort of talk about the very gendered impacts that this has, because the majority of garment workers around the world are women. And the fashion industry has long been linked with the sexual exploitation of women. And do my panelists, do you think that there's something specific about kind of garment workers or the fashion industry that creates this imbalance, and you know, what can we do, what can be done to change that? And I'll start with yes.
Over 80% of the world's garment workers are women, so by default you just get more of gender-based violence in an industry that is that heavily weighted on women, first of all. Second of all, it's one of the most precarious jobs in the world. So these women living in the global south who are at the mercy of these factory owners are just some of the most vulnerable women in the world. And when they don't know if they're going to be able to feed their children, they're starving themselves, etc., you're just put in that position where you almost have no power.
Yeah, and I think the issue of power in the fashion industry is such a big one. I want to talk a bit about kind of, obviously, as an industry, the fashion industry has a huge problem with power imbalance internally through the supply chain, but then outwardly, and also in terms of, you know, representation, sizism, racism, normalization of, you know, unachievable Eurocentric beauty standards. And I'd like to talk a bit more about how these kind of power imbalances have manifested and how they're developing and if they're changing. It's a big one.
Yeah, I guess I could speak to this a bit. As far as marketing goes, the mainstream marketing space has always been rooted in hierarchies and creating that aspirational image, as you said. And that hierarchy, that aspirational image has always been centered on whiteness. And that's looked like a lot of different ways, whether that's the multi-billion-dollar, you know, skin lightening industry in country or continents like Asia and Africa, to, you know, the Eurocentric focus on who represents like the modeling world. And so I think in addition to like the damaging impacts of centering whiteness, I think another major injustice of the mainstream marketing space is how much contemporary culture has drawn from BIPOC communities, whether that's Black culture, Indigenous designs, and how those communities have been precisely erased. As far as where we go from here, I think it's kind of an interesting moment in time because BIPOC voices have suddenly become older rage as people realize racism is real in 2020. And so I think it's really important to see the work that's being done beyond tokenism, beyond using BIPOC, you know, communities and voices as a ways to position yourself as diverse and inclusive. But how is a brand actually contributing to wealth redistribution? How are their supply chains actually reflecting this equity? Because we know that it is women of color that are disproportionately affected and represented when it comes to supply chains. So I'm thinking about the, you know, Nike hijab campaigns of the world that's talking about, you know, representing Muslim women, when it's Muslim women in Indonesia that are subject to a host of labor exploitation to gender-based violence. So I think we need to go beyond just, you know, face value understandings of what diversity and inclusion looks like and seeing how that's actually being materialized in practice when it comes to fashion and beyond. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add to that as someone, you know, who has also been a sustainability and a diversity and inclusion consultant. You know, I've consulted with startups, I've consulted with Fortune 500 brands, and this completely depends on the company, but I also want to speak to, I think a lot of people tend to kind of breathe a sigh of relief at the wrong time. When somebody says that if you're a company and you have one person on your team who is the lead on sustainability or is the lead on diversity and inclusion, that doesn't mean that they fix the problem, because someone from the top can still say, well, I don't like your ideas and I'm just not going to implement them. I have experienced that. You know, as a sustainability consultant, I've worked with brands who are very receptive and are like, okay, you know, we're going to start, you know, implementing these suggestions that you've made, and we're going to start, you know, having more representation in these areas, both outward facing and inwardly, internally within our own company. And then I've worked with companies that, you know, just one word from the top can be like, you know, actually, we're just not going to do that. And it's in a very roundabout way. And so I also want to speak to, we have to advocate for the people that, you know, these companies bring on to fix everything. You know, I'm very, very, you know, it's very important to me to never work with a brand that just wants to bring me on to make them look good. And tokenism is extremely, extremely rampant. And, you know, I've never let myself get in that kind of situation, but there are a lot of times where if you have like one person, you know, just kind of, you know, on the lower rungs who is, you know, making these suggestions, whether or not those suggestions are being taken and utilized within the company, both externally and internally, is what's really most important. And so, you know, just speaking from that perspective, like I said, a lot of people kind of breathe this type of relief of like, oh, they've hired such and such, you know, as head of diversity and inclusion, like, oh, great. Okay, so we're good. No, like you need to have people, you have to have board members and, you know, what is the CEO thing? You have the people at the top who are also advocates for diversity and inclusion and just throughout the entire, you know, company as well. That's just something I kind of want to speak to. We tend to put a lot of pressure on one person within a company to fix everything when it needs to be, it's more holistic for, you know, pretty much every rung of a business to really have a focus on these issues. And that's something that I have seen, you know, from the Black Lives Matter, you know, kind of resurgence, because Black Lives Matter has been around for a while. It just got a resurgence in 2020. You know, more people are demanding Black, brown, and indigenous people in higher up positions, you know, instead of just bringing on one person to speak for an entire issue. You want to have a whole ecosystem of, you know, people who can drive this change and make sure that, you know, it's not an issue getting it past the top. That's just something I wanted to bring to people's attention, because, you know, I think that, you know, it's kind of looks one way from the outside and sometimes a different way on the inside.
Yeah, Flora.
Just very quickly, I agree. I mean, there haven't been many events in the last year, but I have to say from the events that I have been to in sustainable fashion in general, sustainability space, they are primarily white and middle class. And while there haven't been many events in the last year, I have noticed a bit more of a trend towards a bit more inclusivity and diversity. And like you say, it cannot just be tokenism. It can't just be all show and all talk and no action. And there's still definitely a way to go, but I have noticed people, you know, making sure that if they're on a panel, that there is a diverse panel. If they're talking about, if they're promoting a sustainable fashion brand, that there's size inclusivity and it doesn't just go up to a size 12. Like all of this kind of stuff, people are speaking about it more, and action is obviously more important than words, but words I feel like can promote action as well. And I do feel like it's improving. It's slow, it's really, really slow, but I've definitely seen change in the last year compared to the previous years.
Yeah.
I would like to spill some tea. I'm not going to name the platform, but there's an online platform who I messaged maybe a year and a half ago about contributing to their blog. I think I asked if they paid writers and they said it depends on their experience, which is not a great answer. But they, a few months later, posted something about wanting to create a network of creators and writers that they could add to a mailing list and email when they had opportunities for commissions. And I did that, and they did not add me to the mailing list. And I messaged and emailed several times over a few months being like, you know, I signed up to this mailing list, what's going on? And then I go onto their website and a white person has written an article about Black Lives Matter. And I just, like, this is my everyday life, just seeing brands that I know are shady, putting on a show like they're, you know, the epitome of like social justice. And these kind of things happen all the time if you're on social media and you're a Black or brown person. A lot behind the scenes, like in the DMs and things like that. And I do think about calling these brands out, but then I worry about getting hate. So there's power imbalance in that sense as well.
Yeah,
And if I could just, I just wanted to add one point to what Amaya and Zainab were saying, but I think it's really important that whether it's sustainability or diversity, these are not add-ons. They have to be embedded into a DNA of a company, right? So as Maya was saying, whether it's the boardroom or, you know, who's on your billboard, that needs to be reflected internally and externally. So it's really important to interrogate sustainability and inclusion initiatives, especially when they're born out of moments of crisis, which often positions it as like damage control or a PR move on the brand's part.
Thank you so much. I think now is a good time. It's also something I should have done at the beginning, and so please forgive me, but we are opening up to questions from our audience. If you just write them in the Facebook comment section, they'll be sent over to me and I'll be able to ask our panel if any of our audience members have any specific questions. Now's the time to sort of write them in, and they'll be sent over to me. Thank you so much for all of that. I think obviously something that is incredibly clear is that power needs to be evenly distributed, but it isn't. Do you think there is space in the future for big corporations, for big brands that we know have a power imbalance where all the power is at the top and it doesn't trickle down the supply chain?
I think big corporations are only big as we know them because they're built on exploitation of labor and resources. So unless we dismantle that or reimagine or rethink what a big corporation is, that what we know big corporations as now can't function in the kind of fashion industry that all of us here are trying to imagine and work towards.
I think this is a time when, this is when we really start to look to legislation, policy, auditing, third-party certification, because I genuinely don't have a lot of faith in some of these large companies to govern themselves to do the right thing for people and the planet. And so, this is something that I think, is answered through, of course, you have consumers who are speaking with their dollars, who are boycotting brands, and who are supporting, the ethical and sustainable and, BIPOC-owned brands. But not everybody has the same kind of buying power, and I think that's when you really have to start looking at, and I know there's more like legislation and policy that's in the works around this kind of around the world. But that's when it's really time to make it like, hey, this can either, whether you want to have it to be an international crime, or if you want to make it, or if you want to, focus in on where you're going to have to, if you're not meeting these certain, marks around sustainability, around CSR or, ethical practices, then you're just going to have to get taxed more, whatever that means, whatever that looks like. Those are all of the initiatives that I'm personally behind, because like I said, self-governing, these companies, I don't trust it, because I especially look at a lot of companies who are like, we want to start being more ethical, more sustainable. How can we get consumers to know just how ethical and sustainable we are? And it's like, you shouldn't be worrying about the consumer's perception. You should be worried about Mother Earth's perception and your workers' perception, and how, if they feel like they're being treated fairly, and a lot of these people are still looking from a advertising perspective. Like, advertising has been a big crux of the fashion industry for forever at this point. And so I think that, if it's not going to make them look good to their market, to their consumer base, then they don't really care. And so that's why I think we need to go above them at this point, and kind of step beyond just holding them accountable just by telling them, hey, this is bad, don't do this. Because I think they're only going to listen so much, Oh, you're muted, Hannah.
Yeah. I had to happen at least once. Aditi, did you want to come in on that? Or is it someone else?
Oh, sure. Flora, did you want to start?
Well, I mean, mainly just to massively agree with Maya as well. I agree that the fashion industry is now such an international industry. It's global. I think it kind of almost needs to go above individual governments and more to a kind of intergovernmental control, like we see more with the food industry, which still has its problems, but a little bit more regulation. And there's a great, third party accreditations are amazing. but they provide a business with a kind of look at me, I'm doing amazingly sort of standpoint. They should be the norm. They should be the minimum that these brands are trying to achieve. And I feel like with more intergovernmental, international control and enforcement of regulations and standards and all that kind of stuff, we'd see a fashion industry that can't escape justice in a way. And currently they are able to do that just by moving countries when new regulations come in.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the question of like the future of fashion and the role of big corporations, I'd first like to say, like, if I had my way, the utopic version of the fashion future would be, you know, localized economies, fiber sheds that are based in land-based, nature-based solutions. As someone mentioned in the panel before, we like to say that, you know, what is the most sustainable fiber or textile? But we really need to look at what's indigenous to a landscape, not just like cotton or linen or jute. You know, it's a lot more, sustainability requires context. So I want to start with that caveat. But in terms of imagining the role of big corporations, if we're talking about the role of big corporations going forward, we need to have very real conversations on wealth inequality. Billionaires are made through exploitation, and it's not lost on me that the Zaras and H&Ms of the world have CEOs that are among the richest men in the world. We need to have very real conversations on scale and speed, going back to the idea that fast fashion is predicated on speed at all costs, even human lives that they see as disposable, material use. But Maya, you touched on corporate social responsibility, which is something I'd love to kind of expand on. And, you know, CSR is a concept that we see growing a lot, going hand in hand with sustainability. But the failure of CSR is that it's usually voluntary measures that are self-audited. And it usually reflects or mirrors local law. What I am really pushing that brands and consumers alike kind of advocate for is the idea of worker-driven social responsibility. Worker-driven social responsibility is rooted in the idea that workers dictate the future that they like to see in terms of creating a, you know, working landscape rooted in equity and accountability, having direct lines of accountability when there are instances of labor exploitation. And worker-driven social responsibility is rooted in legally binding documents and third-party audits. So again, accountability. And if folks are interested in looking at examples of what that can look like, I'm actually working a lot in LA with the Garment Worker Protection Act. I have a lot of content on my Instagram, but basically garment workers in LA have organized and to enact a policy that would get rid of the piece rate, which we have in LA, which means workers are making as little as 2 to 3 cents per piece they make, as opposed to a minimum wage. And it would create a direct line of accountability from brand to factory to garment worker. So when there are instances of labor exploitation, like we had a campaign where 4 garment workers were collectively owed $800,000 in unpaid wages from Ross between 4 workers. And it wasn't an accusation, it was a claim that they won in the labor court, but Ross blamed the factory and the factory blamed Ross. Those instances should not end up with no justice. And so I think that's a very important thing to think about, because at its core, for me, sustainability is an interrogation of power. So we always have to be thinking about the ways that we can build power at the bottom and take power from the top, whatever that might look like. So, yeah.
Thanks so much. And I do think a lot of things that were just said have answered many of the questions that we've got. But one particular one, which I think has been asked a couple of times, is how do we make sure the fashion industry is seen within the wider climate justice movement? Like, I think a lot of people are waking up to the fact that the climate crisis intersects totally with social and political issues, but how do we fit fashion into that as individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the same way that, you know, take for example, the same way that you have, major voices in sustainability speaking about the impacts of factory farming. And then that's raised awareness around, for example, plant-based diets or veganism. And then, more the average person kind of has that connection. The average person who is, keeping up on environmental issues does have that awareness that, hey, eating plant-based may be better for the environment, or eating, locally sourced, whatever that may be. And so I think that it will just take more of the mainstream sustainability circle, the same way that we pulled, the same way they pulled, have factory farming contribute to a lot of, CO2 emissions, that we also have to speak to how the fashion industry produces 1.2 billion tons of, CO2 emissions per year. Like it needs to just kind of blend in very, the way that blended in so seamlessly and didn't feel like, well, this is, like a offshoot conversation about the food industry. What does this have to do with sustainability? It never felt like that, because it was pinpointed such a huge contributing factor to the climate crisis. And so I really want more leaders in sustainability to pinpoint how the fashion industry and all the surrounding industries like shipping are, contributing to the climate crisis in really, in a way that's, often underrepresented. I think that's really kind of what it will take. We're just going to have to center these conversations and some of the more mainstream discussions around sustainability. It's not something that's irrelevant or a niche, or, it's kind of only barely, making a dent, like this is something that is hugely contributing to the climate crisis. And most environmental activists that overlook this, I feel, are really missing a big part. The same way we speak to how it's necessary to talk about environmental racism, environmental justice, because how Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are the most adversely impacted by environmental issues, including the climate crisis. And now we know it's important to speak to the benefits of, looking at the factory farming industry and, speaking about like plant-based living, that it just needs to really go hand in hand. So I just would encourage more people. You don't have to make it your whole entire niche that you're speaking to it, but it just needs to be more commonplace. More people just need to be educated about it and, know who to hold accountable, what they can do to help, what they can do to spread the word, what companies they should be writing, so on and so forth.
My internet dropped a little bit, so I hope I'm not repeating anything that Maya said, but I think fashion is seen as frivolous, and people who are not interested in fashion or interested in style think that they don't participate in the system. But if you wear clothes, which is most people, you participate in the system. So I think coming to that understanding and even just learning a little bit about the environmental impact of the fashion industry and a little bit about the human impact can really just get people thinking more. So the first thing that I usually signpost people to is the True Cost documentary, which you can watch if you have Prime. I know Amazon is bad, but if you have a Prime subscription, you can watch it on there. Or Kristen Leo has a 4-minute video on YouTube that breaks down the fashion industry. So if you're someone who really knows nothing, I feel like it only takes a few facts for you to start building an idea of what the industry actually is and how you participate in it. At the moment, I'm doing this 4-week action plan that I'm mainly advertising on my Instagram page, but next week is about ethical consumption versus activism. So I think if you're just starting to learn about this stuff, that would be like it's the final week, but it would still be a good time to join it. The task is going to be to come up with like an activism goal for yourself, but then also a consumption goal for yourself. So you can think about those two aspects of what you can do, because if you don't have money or access to different small sustainable businesses or whatever it is to shop for your clothes, then you can still do other things, whether that's calling out brands or writing to your MP or whatever. So yeah, if you want to know more about that, you can just go to my Instagram page and everything is on there.
On that note, I do think that people forget how much power they have as the consumer, whether or not you're spending money at particular shops, emailing the brands and requesting or demanding certain things has power. And we see that with the Pay Up campaign since last March. I mean, more than half of the money that was owed to the garment workers has now been said that they're going to pay it back. And that would not have happened without the social media campaign. We have so much power as consumers. And of course, individual action is not the full story, but it can get us a long way. And I feel like a lot of people within this topic can feel really helpless, but we're not as individuals helpless, and there is so much you can do. So just by following people who talk about this, including everyone else on this panel, I mean, I follow all of you guys and you post such useful information, you can start to see how as individuals we can all make a change. And yeah, it starts with the individual really, because we all wear clothes.
Yeah, just adding on to that, I think in many movements, we tend to create a dichotomy between individual action and systemic change. But there's also ways that when we think of ourselves as beyond a consumer, but a citizen, our individual actions will actually help materialize systemic change if we think about grassroots organizing or policy work. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. As far as the question at hand, I think the project of fast fashion, the goal of it has always been to make consumers apathetic about where their clothes come from. So like, who made my clothes, right? And so we need to remember that the two pillars of the fashion industry are land and labor. We can't forget that fashion, unless it's made of synthetic materials, which is a very big reality, is a product of agriculture. So in terms of environmental impacts, there are huge implications for the ways that we are practicing agricultural practices, how we can return to indigeneity when it comes to what fibers we are planting, where we're planting it, and regenerative approaches. And then the other part of it is the labor side, which we know exists in a racialized context, both in practice and in policy. And as we know, social justice is environmental justice. And so we can't remove those two conversations from one another. When I was, first in the sustainable fashion industry 8 years ago, every time I brought up race and identity, it was seen as distractions to the movement. So I think we've had a very important cognitive shift in the last few years of centering precisely elements of identity, history, racism as the core questions we need to pose if we want to acknowledge the crisis of the fashion industry or the climate crisis, which are inherently tied. And I'm going to say it again: interrogate power, whether it's racism, fashion, the way they're connected. Goes back to understanding how power has been centralized in a way that is not benefiting the masses, especially BIPOC communities globally.
I forgot to say in my introduction that I'm fashion editor for It's Freezing in LA magazine, and just jumping off of what Aditi said, I've written for the upcoming issue on the interconnectivity of the exploitation of labor and land in South Asia, and how South Asians in the diaspora are using their kind of trauma to drive sustainable fashion forward. So if you're interested in that, definitely follow It's Freezing in LA. I think that's coming out in May.
Thanks so much. And Flora, I'm glad you brought up the Pay Up campaign, because I hope to end on a slightly positive note, kind of off the back of the Pay Up campaign and other successful movements. How can we keep up the momentum of kind of forcing change from and redistributing power from the top? If anyone has any hope for the movement that they want to share, just for the closing comments.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, first of all, hope is necessary. It is a necessary fuel for change and for activism. And, this is something that I've personally learned in my own work and also through the work of others. I live in Atlanta, which is the heart of a lot of the civil rights movement. And I've personally learned that, I think that hope and optimism and enjoying that kind of collectivism that we can make a change is very precious, and it's something that this oppressive systems often try to steal from us, especially BIPOC communities. And so I think that, one, it's necessary to make change. And then two, I think that we really need to think about kind of basically reframe our way of thinking almost about everything. We're talking a lot about decolonization and, even decolonizing the way that we think of things. And, there was one question that you originally had sent to me that made me kind of think when you were talking about, how the fashion industry is, one that kind of prides itself on innovation. And, I think there are two different types of innovation, that we really need to think about. I really think we need to look at second glance innovation, because innovation that's driven by capitalism isn't necessarily innovation per se. It's just, how can I make more money, or how can I just do this just for the sake of doing it? But when I say like second glance innovation, we're thinking about, how will this benefit the world? How will this benefit future generations, or how will this benefit other communities of people in some way, and won't just, I'm just going to make money at the end of the day. And I think that we kind of just need to really reframe. And also, I'm glad that Aditi started speaking to, some of the more like traditional methods of indigeneity within the fashion industry. Really, of course, recognizing the impact of environmental tech, but also recognizing the importance of biomimetic thinking, biomimetic design, and traditional ecological knowledge, and letting those two sectors work together, and letting the originators of that knowledge be the ones in charge, instead of just exploiting it. Because as we start talking about like traditional ecological knowledge, my biggest fear is that it's just going to be exploited from people of African and indigenous and descent. Like that's one of my number one fears. And so I think that because we're at a place where we're having conversations like this, we are covering, race, we're covering gender, we're covering all of these different layers to how every industry is impacted by these layers, that we can, sort of start to implement solutions and hold brands to implement solutions that are more holistic and look at the whole ecosystem of these issues and these topics. I want to see more people talking around the disabled community as well, how a lot of garment workers are going to end up being climate migrants, and how, the abysmal pay that they receive will affect if they can even migrate in, safely as the climate changes. So there's so many layers to this, but I am seeing these layers being spoken about and unraveled more and more and more every day. And so that is what gives me hope that there are, people out there, like everybody on this panel and everyone who's watching, who is interested and is wanting to do the work and is already doing the work. And I think that it's only going to continue to grow because we have such a huge access to information and information exchange that we never had before. So I definitely have hope for the future, and that all these issues can be simultaneously addressed in a way that's, hopefully really effective for the future.
Thank you so much. And I think that is the perfect note to end it on, a message of hope, because I know that our panel have other speaking commitments to get to, because this is the life we live in, Zoom to Zoom. But thank you to my panel so much for such an amazing conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us. This is recorded, as you know. It will be on our Facebook for anyone who missed it, or if you've got anyone who wanted to make it but couldn't, please redirect them. And yes, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day or evening, wherever you are. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.